So hit us up in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from. And please remember throughout the program to send your questions. We will be taking your questions, whether they're questions for me or for our esteemed guest that we will have on shortly. Today in the United States is an official federal holiday known as Thanksgiving. And we recently published a blog piece about the holiday of Thanksgiving and what it's supposed to commemorate versus the reality of the experience of many indigenous people, or we could say most indigenous people here in the Americas. And the blog piece connects a specific type of conquest that was experienced and is experienced, present tense, by indigenous people in the Americas. And it connects it to the same experience of Palestinians across Palestine, especially in Gaza and the West Bank. And this is a particular form of conquest that is known as settler colonialism. Now, why is settler colonialism different and distinct and important? That settler colonialism is a process by which a foreign group of people come in and they dispossess the original inhabitants of their land. And they use violence and terrorism and intimidation in order to take their land from them, force them off, sometimes corral them into open air prisons or concentration camps or reservations, as the case may be, and take everything else from them. So this is something that, even though it is celebrated as a holiday in the United States, there's a lot of controversy over whether this should be celebrated at all. Is this something that we should be celebrating? Now, of course, there's sort of a historical revisionist myth that is put to it, which has to do with giving thanks and how people helped each other and these sorts of things. However, it sanitizes and it whitewashes what is, even if there were moments of perhaps collaboration, it sanitizes and whitewashes what is almost entirely a history of brutal violence and domination of one people by another. And so many people reject the idea of celebrating this day, that this day is not something to celebrate, that even if giving thanks, yes, is something that obviously is fundamental to everything that we do as a Muslim, that, you know, if you could perhaps sum up all of Islam within one concept, we could say gratitude. It is gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, gratitude to everything that he has done for us and continues to do for us. So it's not the problem of giving thanks or being thankful or gratitude, but rather it is, what is the particular history of giving of this particular land, of the interaction of the people that were coming from abroad, that were not indigenous to this land, with the people who were indigenous to it. This is something that unfortunately is erased when we sort of only construct a holiday. We call it Thanksgiving. We get around and we eat turkey or whatever. And this leaves to the side the entire fiqh issue of the celebration of the holidays of the kuffar and things like that. Even if we were to say, just for a moment, put that to the side and don't consider it, is this something that we should be celebrating when this is sort of the history behind this day? So I encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to check out our blog post. You can find it on Yaqeen Institute's website and look under the blog posts and give it a read and see how this is exactly the same thing that is being experienced today by the Palestinians. And we have many people that are chiming in here. We have Salwa from Minnesota. MashaAllah, very nice. I've been to Minnesota multiple times, a very cold place, but a very nice and beautiful place. We have Josephine from the Philippines. We have many people coming in. So again, mashallah, tabarakallah, our audience is global. We have Inisaya from Indonesia. Selamat datang. Welcome. So a lot of people that are watching from abroad, they might not be. Aishi from KL, Kuala Lumpur. Selamat datang. We have Selma from Portland, Oregon. I was able to visit Portland, Oregon last year. A very, very beautiful place. Ali from Misr, from Egypt. Ahlan wa sahlan. MashaAllah, multiple people. Sunflower from Walaikum Salam from Minneapolis. So welcome. We have a global audience, and not everybody knows the dynamics of some of the things that happen in the U.S., which is why it takes a little bit of unpacking. So when it comes to Palestine, wa alaikum salam, Tariq from Al Jazair, and we have folks from the UK. Well, our guest tonight is from the UK as well, and mashallah, it's very early for you. They're catching you after your tahajjud. Folks from Las Vegas, from LA, the West Coast, Denmark, mashallah, Germany, Allahu Akbar, Dominican Republic, very, very nice. Bienvenido. And one of the things that I benefited from my Sheikh Abdullah Shankiti in Medina, and this is something that you could say, we have Wa alaikum salam, Shafi from Florida, is to be concerned. And this is something that Sami Hamdi remarked when he was on the live stream some weeks ago. From Virginia, we have, mashallah, Seattle. Inshallah, I'll be visiting Seattle before too long. Toronto, I was just in Toronto. Chicago, inshallah, heading to Chicago in December. St. Louis, Missouri, Allahu Akbar. North Carolina, gracias de nada. Walaikum salam. Plano, Texas, Indonesia. I love to see all the different places. Bakersfield, California, Allahu Akbar, on the mode trucking. Abdi Musa, ahlan wa sahlan, welcome. Trinidad, mashallah, tabarakallah. So one of the things that is important that I benefited from my Sheikh Abdullah Shankiti is being concerned with the affairs of the Muslims. Okay, and being concerned with the affairs of the Muslims means educating yourself about where they're from, the different places that they're from, the different culture, right? The different foods, the different way of dressing, the different sort of parts of their land. MashaAllah, we have lots of people from India, Ottawa, Des Moines, Allahu Akbar, lots of people. So this is something that honestly it's an extremely powerful tool that can break down the barriers between us. These days, when we're thinking about how to feel as an ummah and how to act as an ummah and how to be united as an ummah, a lot of it starts with educating ourselves. A lot of it starts with educating ourselves and talking to each other, right? If you meet someone from Bangladesh, to ask them, are they from Dhaka? Are they from Sylhet? Are they from this part or that part? Most of the time people will be amazed. Wow, you know something about where I'm from, and automatically those boundaries start to drop in between you, right? If someone's from Malaysia, right? You're from Kuala Lumpur, you're from Terengganu or Kelantan or from different parts. Knowing something about, we saw the Prime Minister of Malaysia had very strong words for the President of the United States very recently. It inspired a lot of us. This is something that brings us together. So knowing something about your brothers and sisters, where they're from, where they live. Kent, mashallah, wa alaikum salam. I know a brother who's from Kent, studied with me in Medina. So these sorts of things they're not just time fillers. They're actually very, very significant to coming together as an ummah. Djibouti, mashallah, North Carolina, to educate ourselves. Lombok, mashallah, that's beautiful. To understand something about each other, to understand, even like I said, if it's just dress or it's clothes or it's food or it's geography or it's language, right? Being able to say hello or welcome in all of the languages of the ummah would be a beautiful thing, and something that would go just a little bit further in uniting us. So when we talk about settler colonialism, right? So we're talking about this controversial holiday that really has a dark history behind it in the United States, Thanksgiving, and how it relates to the type of experience that, wa alaikum salam from Pakistan, people that are in Palestine are experiencing right now, right? When it comes to people that are coming in, taking over their homes, kicking them out, dispossessing them from their land, right? Taking over, herding them onto, in the United States, we call them reservations. What is Gaza but a reservation, or even, let's bring it further, as other scholars have mentioned, a concentration camp, right? This is exactly what settler colonialism looks like. Now, there's an important distinction to be made, and one that we have made elsewhere, especially in the blog post, which I recommend everybody to check out, that settler colonialism is just one type of conquest. Not all conquests are examples of settler colonialism. And when you look at Islam and how Islam spread and how the original sort of generations of Muslims expanded into North Africa or expanded into other parts of the world, they did not conquer like this. They did not practice settler colonialism. They did not burn down villages. They did not kick people out of their homes. This is barbaric practices that the Muslims thankfully did not engage in. Rather, the Muslims, they set up garrison towns. Many of the famous cities, Kufa, Basra, Fustat, that we know of today were originally garrison towns that the Muslim conquerors, they set up to keep the Muslim population separate. So even though the administration or the rulership would change, that the people were pretty much left alone for the most part, and that the actual adoption of Islam was something that took a lot longer in a very organic and non-coerced way. So knowing our own history, in addition to turning towards each other and educating ourselves about each other and understanding each other as an ummah, is one important point. But also educating ourselves about our own history, right? Yes, Australia. Good day. From Victoria, we have a few people from Australia, Queensland. Australia is another very striking example on the sort of American style settler colonialism, with the Aboriginal folks of Australia know this very well. So this is something that we have to educate people, because these are deflection tactics. We've seen many people that apologize for the genocide that is going on to our brothers and sisters in Palestine. They say, "Oh, this is what everybody does. This is just history, right? Everybody, they conquer the same way." No, that's not true. That's how you conquer. That's not how Muslims have conquered. That's not how Islam is spread. Islam is spread in such a way that it actually benefits and uplifts the people around it, not subjugates them and makes their lives into a living hell. So that's a brief word about that. Now we'd like to bring on, wa alaikum salam, Sister Fatima from Toronto. We've got, mashallah, a lot of a broad audience is always here. We're going to bring on a very, very special guest, and his name is Dr. Anas Altikriti. Now, Dr. Anas is somebody who is based in the UK, so we appreciate very much him tiring himself to join us on the program today. But Dr. Anas is a person of long experience and a lot of very, very interesting skill set and activities. One of the more important things is he's a founder of Cordoba Institute, which attempts to foster understanding between the Muslim world and the West, in addition to a ton of other initiatives. Dr. Anas, ahlan wa sahlan, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Hayyak Allah wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. It's a pleasure to be with you today, Imam Tom. I'm not entirely sure whether we should talk about Thursday or Friday. It's 2 a.m. where I am today, but alhamdulillah, it's a great honor and privilege to be with you today.
Barakallahu feekum. Either way, in the Sharia, it's Jum'ah. So it's Jum'ah for us after Maghrib, and it's Jum'ah for you. So alhamdulillah.
True.
So give us a little bit of background about the Cordoba Foundation. And I also wanted to get into, there's been a smear campaign against the Cordoba Foundation and yourself, in a very similar way to our previous guest, Dr. Hatem Bazian, with his foundations. So if you could enlighten us as to the work that you do and that the Cordoba Foundation does, and sort of the smear campaign that has been set up against you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you about an array of issues, obviously within the context of what's happening in Gaza. But your introduction is extremely important in trying to outline something that we now know and identify as a settler colonial project. But there's something which is quite important, and it ties in directly to what I'll speak about in terms of my personal experience, as well as the experience of the Cordoba Foundation. And that is that this kind of project necessitates the dehumanization of the other, seeing the other as being less, as being of a second, probably even third degree. And this started several centuries ago, probably in the 18th century, when British colonialists actually formed this within an ideology that was to mark the next 200 years. And that is essentially that it was the white man's burden to educate others. The white man in Europe particularly saw himself as being higher, as being supreme, as having attained all the skills necessary to be called civilized. and that all others, especially the black man of Africa, of Asia, of Latin America, of even North America, the indigenous populations of Australia and the such, were all of a lesser capacity and aptitude, and they needed to be educated. They needed to be helped against their own inclinations, their own ways and the such, and therefore it was termed the white man's burden. And as you know, is famous, Rudyard Kipling's famous poem about that very concept, which led the way then to the various settler colonial projects, whether it be in North America, whether it be in Australia, whether it be in South Africa, for instance, which we saw the end of. Alhamdulillah, we saw for ourselves how that particular episode ended. And obviously, Palestine was supposed to be also another series within that horrid chain. But coming back to the Cordoba Foundation, the Cordoba Foundation was established in January 2005. So it's been almost 19 years now. And it was found at the back of the enormous anti-war demonstrations that engulfed the entire world. I was one of the organizers of the demonstrations around the world against the war in Iraq, and previous to that, the war in Afghanistan. I was one of the chairs of the historic 2 Million March, which is still till this day the biggest march and demonstration in the history of the United Kingdom. And the thinking was, because if you recall, or maybe you're too young to recall, but after 9/11, what happened was that there was a narrative that re-emerged. And that narrative was something that was proposed by the likes of Francis Fukuyama and Samuel Huntington in the early 90s about the clash of civilization. And their proposition was essentially that Islam was incapable of living with any other, and that there was a necessity to clash because of the intrinsic nature of Islam. And that at the time wasn't really taken seriously. But after 9/11, all of a sudden, everyone returned to that ideology and thought, well, there we go, that explains it. So we found it necessary to counter that by providing channels of information that are somewhat different from the channels available at the time. And therefore, the Cordoba Foundation was founded. Now, you're absolutely right. In terms of yesterday, your guest, Dr. Hatem Bazian, and many, many others, countless others. And I count myself privileged to be amongst them, and my organization to be amongst them. It's when you're impactful, when you're effective. It's when your work has a real effect and a real impact, and you reach to other people, and people start to listen to what you have to say. All of a sudden, it becomes problematic, and therefore you need to be shut down. And yes, we have for years now, longer than I care to count, to be perfectly honest. We've not only been attacked and vilified by corners of the media, but also, practical terms like being debanked, having our bank accounts closed time and time again. Every single time we have an event, we have something happening, we almost now know to expect exactly how it's going to play out and how we're going to be attacked. But listen, Alhamdulillah, I'd rather not talk about that much, simply because we have far more important things to do. And the Cordoba Foundation, Alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah, is simply one cog within the machine of change, the mechanism of transformation that the entire world requires, starting from that very conceptual point of seeing the other as being less and less deserving and less human, onto creating an environment that is conducive to the very best of human aptitude and capacity.
That's very, very well stated, and you're speaking my language entirely. I kind of woke up on 9/11. I think that was an awakening for me. I was in 8th grade, and it was sort of the beginning of my politicization. and sort of my own intellectual journey. I was able, by the grace of Allah, to figure out enough things to be against the invasion of Iraq, even as a teenager, and to do what little I could do as a teenager, to participate in whatever was going on around me at that time. And since then, it's been this, for me, it's remarkable to see how everything comes full circle. This progression and this march where everything that's happened since then, there's a unicity to it, and to the point where in uni I did study post-colonial theory. That was basically what led me to Islam, to give things a very, very short account. But when you say seeing the other as lack, this is exactly the language of the academy in which I was trained. The sort of the ideological anatomy, like how could it happen, right? Definitely, like post-colonial theory, always looking for what makes the colonizer colonize. Why this type of brutality and this type of degradation? And one of the useful things that has entered into our lexicon since the escalation in Palestine in the last month and a half has been this idea that every accusation is a confession. And I think that, when you're talking about Fukuyama and the clash of civilizations, and this idea that Islam cannot accommodate, right? And if we know what we know about history, about how Islam actually did accommodate very, very well difference, in a way that was superior to what the modern Western world has offered when it comes to accommodating difference, I think that we're onto yet another accusation that is actually a confession, that the contemporary architecture of the international world order, liberalism, whatever you want to put whose ever doorstep you want to put the blame on, that the status quo cannot accommodate difference very well. And I think so often in terms of redemption, about how Islam is, I think, a tremendous redemptive force, and that it has the opportunity to actually educate people and show people precisely what you're saying, which is that difference does not have to be lack. It doesn't have to be less, that we can see the humanity and value the humanity of the other. And that perhaps Islam is the best system to teach people how that is to be done. So that's very sort of, I didn't prepare to talk about that, but you're speaking to my heart. And so I had to comment on that. I don't know if you had any other further reflections on this.
Well, you're absolutely right. And even, the adoption of the name, the Cordoba Foundation, Cordoba being the epitome of Spanish civilization. And I mean civilization, meaning the very engine that geared Europe towards modernity as we know it today. That particular time, that in Spanish historians' language, they call it the 100 golden years. Those 100 years ruled by Muslims, in which every single person, every single citizen, was part of making and shaping the cities and the future. And in fact, we have records of Jews being ministers within the Andalusia, within the construct, the political as well as administrative construct. We have Christians, and those were the years until today. Hundreds of millions from around the world flock to Spain to see the remnants of, to see the remains of, simply because it was what started, what really engineered the next 3, 4, 5 centuries. So you're absolutely right, and this that you ended off with, and that is the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us diverse, created us different, in order so that we mingle, that we get to know each other, that we exchange experiences, that we get to know each other's perspectives, is something which is absolutely central to the idea, to the very concept of Islam. In fact, I would go further and suggest, and I'm no scholar of other religions, but I know in Islam that we have in Surah Al-Isra, in verse 70, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states verily we have honored, or we have dignified the people of Adam, the sons of Adam, meaning every single one. Now, I don't know of a religion, a faith, an ideology that states that every single human being, whoever they are, whatever a culture that they subscribe to, whatever their political dominion, whatever their lifestyle, is honored and dignified, not by anyone's decree, but by Allah's order. And that is something which I find is central to everything that we do and everything that we call for.
Beautiful. That's a very profound reflection. I'd like to remind the audience to please send in your questions for Dr. Anas while we have him. I'll be asking my own questions, and then we'll be getting around to yours. So please just type in your questions to the chat, and we'll leave time for questions. Now, another question I'd like to ask you. So I was reading a bit about your bio today. You were doing some work with the Muslim Association of Britain, and then there came this time where you left. And what I had read, and you correct me if I'm wrong, because this is just from the internet, but there was a climate after 9/11 where it was very, very difficult for Muslims to continue doing political activism and political work. And it seems like many people turned away from that work and started going into maybe safer activities, such as education or community development or things like that. From what I gleaned, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, you chose to stay doing the political work. And why? I want to ask why. If that's accurate, then why? And second, why I'm asking you this question is because we're in a similar climate today. We're seeing the backlash, we're seeing the doxing, we're seeing all these attempts to smear people. I'm afraid that people are again going to shy away and try to go back into hiding and not face this thing head on. What is the value of holding down the fort and standing up at this very, very difficult moment and to continue doing the political work?
You're right in terms of your description of what's happened, and I agree with you absolutely that it's a question that was and is being asked in probably all wherever Islamic da'wah persists, whether it be in Europe, in North America, and Australia, and the such. And that is, where do we focus? Where do we concentrate on? At the time that you're talking about, after 9/11, after the marches that saw hundreds of thousands, at one stage 2 million people turn up in the UK, there was this feeling that, well, we've done as much. Remember, I mean, ultimately, after all those, I would suggest, glorious events that the Muslim community was very much at the forefront of achieving, ultimately, your president at the time, George W. Bush, our prime minister of the time, Tony Blair, took the world to war in Iraq, and we know the catastrophe that has ensued since then. So there was this feeling of despondency. There was this feeling that all of this doesn't really have an impact, doesn't really have an effect, and therefore it's much, much easier for people to find their comfort zones. It's much, much easier to say, you know what, I'm just going to focus on my mosque, because really, my flock really need, my attention. They need to learn Quran more. They need to, and we've been on the streets for so long now, for so many months, and we've mingled with all sorts of people, Muslims as well as non, and maybe we need to go back to basics. And it's a narrative that very few people can actually disagree with, because you're stating something which many people will find quite comforting, and it'll give you that kind of inner comfort that, well, whatever happens with the world, whatever wrongs that prevail in the world, well, you know what, you're going to stay away from that. It's much, much easier. But the fact of the matter is that, to me at least, da'wah itself doesn't work without you being involved in every facet of life. It doesn't work, it can't be impactful unless you're engaged politically, you're engaged with the business community. If you're not engaged with the artistic, if you wish, community, if you're not, every facet of life requires you to be absolutely engaged with everything, every single cause that is the root reason why people are suffering economically, suffering socially, suffering from the security perspective, suffering from the information overload or maybe misinformation. All of this requires your full attention and your full engagement. You just can't say, you know what, I'm not going to touch this corner of the world that I live in. I'm not going to touch this sphere. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. And therefore, many of us, I'm glad to say, stuck with the roots. And yes, those hundreds of thousands turning up every single Saturday became tens of thousands, sometimes became only in their thousands. But we stuck the course, and you know what? Once they were needed to come out for Palestine, all of a sudden we have hundreds of thousands, and we had last weekend another million. So all of this is something that is having an impact. We might not see it, we might not feel it. You know, it's tiny steps, it's very incremental, but what's happening is a real transformation, because now it's not only that 1 million people have turned up, for instance, in London, hundreds of thousands, millions of others around the world, including in the United States, but what is happening is that people have a clearer understanding of what's happening. And this is something that is absolutely different from where we were 20 years ago. And this is something that we need to latch on. And it's something that we need to build with all our friends from across society. And that is the epitome of what da'wah means. Da'wah means to be at the very heart of things, to be at the very center of being at people's service. Whenever they have a question, I'm there to answer. Whenever they want to see an example, I'm there to give that example. Whenever they want guidance, whenever they want to have a discussion and a chat, I am there. If I'm not there, then I'm not doing my job. And I feel, as Muslims, as people who claim to have this noble title of being du'at, I feel that this is where we need to be, on the streets, amongst people, in the middle of our communities, in the middle of our society, at the service of everyone.
Excellent. Well stated, and very inspiring. And I'm glad you said that, because unfortunately, a lot of people take it as a sort of false dilemma. They feel like they have to choose between being on the street or being in the masjid, learning the Quran, or being active politically. And I think what you're saying, and certainly what I'm saying, is that no, there's no dilemma here, that we actually need both. And in order to realize all of the guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us, it has to be implemented. And it has to be implemented around you, in the society that you live in, and through representing and being on hand, manning your post, as we say. That's fantastic. I'd like to switch now to a different sort of set of questions, and I encourage everybody again who's watching to please send in your questions. You do hostage negotiations, which sounds pretty intense. And I'd like you to potentially give the average Joe a window into this world. It's something that we read about. Obviously, it's become very timely again with the prisoner exchange that is supposed to happen, imminently, hopefully. What should the average person maybe know that they don't know about how hostage negotiations work? Can you give us a window into that world?
It's a part of my work that I don't talk about much, for a number of reasons. The first is I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, to be perfectly honest. It necessitates that you work in a very murky part of everything that's happening. It's very backdoor. It's very secretive. It's very confidential. In most cases, in my case, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I've helped with the release of 21 hostages till now, since I started by mere accident in 2006. There are still some 11 or 12 cases that are still ongoing. we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring them to a satisfactory and good conclusion. In many of those cases, I can't say a thing, simply because, victims have their privacy. They don't want people to speak of their plight, and they've gone through horrific things. And therefore, it's not for me to sort of make a story out of their suffering. But basically, I started, as I said, I just stumbled into this. In 2005, there was 4 Christian peacemaker hostages that were taken in Iraq. One who was a British and a friend, called Dr. Norman Kember, an American, Tom Fox, and 2 Canadians. And I was asked if I would consider traveling to Iraq, and that would have been the very first time in my entire life, since I left Iraq as a 2-year-old, that I went to Iraq, if I would go to Iraq and make media appeals, just so that maybe the kidnappers would hear that these people are not occupiers. They're not with the American forces. They're not with the British forces. They were there in order to help as much as they could the Iraqi people. So I was there just to make a media plea, but then that evolved into me getting some phone calls and meeting with some people, and then traveling to some areas, being led on some wild goose trail regarding people claiming, oh, we have them, and what are you going to give us in order to release them? It turns out that they were false trails, and that was a very painful, very stressful, but very informative and eye-opening process. Thankfully, after about 5 or 6 months, 3 of the 4 were released. Tom Fox, unfortunately, was killed just 2 weeks before the others were released, when he tried to escape. So I don't know, you tell me whether that was a success or not, but that then brought up my profile, where people started calling me and saying, well, we have someone in Syria, we have someone in Somalia, we have someone in Libya, we have someone, and so on and so forth. So word of mouth and that particular profile, and alhamdulillah, if I've managed to help them, that's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
MashaAllah. So one of my reflections, so this is the sort of thing that I'm getting at here when I'm asking maybe to a lesson learned or something like this. You began by saying that this is something that happens in a very murky sort of way. Is that because, and this is my impression, that oftentimes the people who are negotiating don't want to be seen as negotiating with each other, and so they have to rely on sort of back channels that they don't even acknowledge exists? Is that accurate to say?
That's part of it, but also because, in my case, because I've made a name for myself that I don't negotiate money. Anyone who wants to talk about ransom money needs to talk to someone else. I've made that very, very clear, and I make it clear to everyone, including the family of the hostages, that I'm not going to negotiate on money, simply because I find it unethical. I can't negotiate millions of dollars or whatever people might need. However, that means that the people that I negotiate with usually have political aspirations, political ambitions.
Right.
And that involves dealing with governments, dealing with political agencies, and I have to say that as horrid and corrupt as some of whom I've had the displeasure of negotiating with at times, I have to say that amongst the worst are governments. The backhandedness, the political interests that are put forward before human life, the often revelation to the media of certain elements which scupper the whole deal, for instance, that's happened several times. So it's very, very unpleasant. Yes, I do deal with people sometimes who have some very skewed ideologies and believe that they are doing this for some very higher aspiration or goal and the such. They don't see the fact that what they're doing is harming and hurting innocent people. They have no inhibition in doing the most heinous things, or threatening at least to do the most heinous things to their hostages, and thinking that they're doing something good. I've had those conversations, but like I said, it's the murkiness and the backhandedness of governments that has dismayed me more than most, I have to say.
And that's a very important point, I think, for the average person to take away. I mean, we've seen that play out in real time with
Yeah,
Netanyahu and
yeah,
how he has dealt or misdealt with the hostages that are supposedly his responsibility, and that he at least pretends to care about. And he's pursued pretty much every single choice, decision, policy that endangers them, as opposed to
yeah.
anything that's going to do anything for them, much to the chagrin and anger of many Israelis. Those are exactly the types of reflections that I think are useful for the average person to kind of keep in mind. If you would permit, just one last question on the sort of the hostage thing before getting into what's going on now in Gaza and the ceasefire. Is you mentioned sort of that you don't deal with situations where people are asking for money. A lot of people, I think the average person would question, like, what are most people after when they take hostages or prisoners? Are people usually after money? Are they, usually after political ideals or something else? What's the typical motivation, or sort of the main motivations that people even purport to have?
The smaller organizations are generally after money.
Mm.
And when they can't get the money, or they don't have the capacity to do the negotiations, they usually sell off the hostages to larger organizations.
Wow.
Now, larger organizations usually are after some political limelight. Either they want to show that they have strength and power, and they want to negotiate certain things, maybe the release of their comrades and friends, maybe some laws locally that they need change or bent, or the like. Usually in my case, I mean, it's only happened 3 or 4 times that once the group asks for money, and I say, okay, I'm stopping this here, I find out later on that they moved on the hostages to someone who can actually engage in a negotiation of a higher scale, which is of political interest. And by the way, those large organizations and groups, they are incredibly politically shrewd. They have built some political capacity. They know what to talk. They know how to talk. They know what to demand. They know when to demand it, and they know their limitations also.
Hmm.
So in the case of several, I could maybe count 5 or 6. It was masterfully done by the group to release the hostages at a particular moment, whereby if they had waited for a few more days, they would have been in danger. But they assessed it absolutely perfectly, and they released the hostages as we had agreed, and they had gained, well, probably they had gained the kind of thing that they wanted in terms of the political gain, the political credit, the show of power. Don't forget, I mean, we're talking about conflict zones. We're talking about very unstable zones where these people operate as gangs. I mean, yes, they might raise a flag saying La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, but in actual fact, their demands, their expectations are extremely mundane, just like any other political group or gang or the such. So alhamdulillah, it's something that I look back at with immense gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not something I would wish to happen again. It's not something that I would wish upon anyone. I don't recommend it as a career path. It leads to many sleepless nights. It leads to many stressful settings with your family where your mind is absolutely somewhere else. But alhamdulillah, in any case, alhamdulillah.
MashaAllah. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I confess my complete ignorance about that entire world, which is why it's kind of fascinating to me, and I appreciate you opening up a bit about it. So, with that experience that you have, when you've seen the last, 45 to 50 days or so, you've seen how the hostages, were taken, and then we had some of them released, and now we have a ceasefire and supposedly a sort of deal on a prisoner exchange of sorts. Could you give us some reflections on how things have been unfolding in this conflict and the ceasefire that has recently been agreed to?
Well, I mean, this ceasefire is somewhat probably 6 weeks too late.
Yeah.
But alhamdulillah, we're here, and it's good that we're not 6 weeks further down the line with thousands more having been slaughtered, as we've seen unfold before our very eyes. This, in all honesty, I mean, for the Israelis, it's very, very clear that the hostages were an important factor, but not the most important factor. And that was what delayed the ceasefire. And that was when governments such as mine in London or yours in Washington should have stepped in far, far earlier in order to prevent or to try to prevent the onslaught that was unleashed by the Israelis against the people of Gaza. The hostages are somewhat important, but there is no question that the Israelis had no qualms about striking areas where they felt the hostages might be. Eliminating the hostages, by the way, and this is something I experienced on 3 or 4 occasions during my career. Eliminating the hostages might be the easiest and the best outcome for certain countries. And I was often pressed by official authorities, by embassies, by certain agencies which I knew spoke on behalf of governments, to identify the location, for instance, that I thought the hostages might be at. And it was clear to me that they wanted to contract groups that would, storm the area and kill everything and everyone. That would have been far easier, far less embarrassing. You know how all countries say we don't negotiate with terrorists?
Right. Yeah.
I would suggest that every single country does actually negotiate with terrorists. It was clear that the Israelis really, in their estimation, if I was to state that they had 4 or 5 strategic objectives from their massacre against Gaza, I would say the hostages maybe were number 3 or 4. They weren't at the top of the list, and therefore they weren't keen on the ceasefire itself.
Right.
They weren't really that. I mean, the only thing that Netanyahu can get from the release of hostages is the hope of some political credit, which he has none of. He's now absolutely running on fumes. He knows very, very well that if hostilities were to stop from the Israeli side today, tomorrow he'd probably be marched to a court of law and then maybe sent to jail. So he's absolutely fighting for his life, and the hostages are merely one of the cards that he's hoping that would turn out in his favor.
I see. Give us some insight from the side of the Palestinian resistance. They took the hostages they took. Uh, what are they attempting to do when they do that? Is this something? This is not a fiqhi discussion. It's not a moral approval or disapproval. But from your experience, what are they attempting to do? And do you think that it makes sense, or have they achieved their goals? Some people are pointing out, for example, that the ceasefire that was agreed to now is largely the similar demands that were made weeks ago. And so therefore, this is something that indicates who's really got the upper hand here, or who has sort of worn out the other side. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, from an absolute strategic point of view, and like you said, not engaging with the fiqhi side of things, I would suggest that the past 6 weeks have been an utter horrific failure for the Israelis, and as hard and as difficult to comprehend, an incredible victory and triumph for the people of Gaza. Now, how can that be when you have more than 14,000 people killed, over 6,000 of whom are children? The fact of the matter is, when you're under occupation, when you're occupied, when you're dehumanized, when you're subjugated, when all your rights are confiscated and in the hands of your oppressor, the only thing you can do is to be an irritant, is to be there. That is the point of the resistance. I find it extremely naive of some who comment and say, well, in terms of numbers, obviously Gaza has been obliterated, obviously. But that's not the point of what we call resistance, which is enshrined in international law. To resist is to be there, is to not be uprooted. That is the point of resistance. An army the size and the capacity and with the international backing that Israel has no other option but to try to uproot the resistance, absolutely eliminate, zero the resistance. If it doesn't do that, then it's lost. From the strategic point of view, it has lost. Now, the taking of hostages is a very important part of any strategic sort of military action or act of resistance or the such, because for every hostage, you can then negotiate. It's a negotiating card. It's not only, harming some artillery or armored machinery or vehicles or the such. It's actually that you have personnel who are vital and crucial, at least in your thinking, in your mind, to your adversary, to your enemy. So it's a negotiating power. And therefore, and this is something very, very important, for the people of Gaza, for Hamas, for the resistance, call them as you may, a hostage is very, very valuable. And therefore, they will be looked after. They will be cared for. They will be cared for even more than the actual citizens of Gaza, simply because they provide cover for the resistance. They provide a negotiating card once the battle arrives at a point where people are sitting around the table or talking at least about some sort of deal. And therefore, those hostages were taken by Hamas in order to negotiate more freedoms, more rights, more the breakout of this prison that we call Gaza, this concentration camp that we call Gaza. Now, from the other side, we're talking now about approximately 100, probably 150 prisoners held by the Israelis, released, and 150 hostages Israeli held by Hamas or by the elements, the resistance in Gaza. Now, the question that comes to mind, and because Hamas has actually listed the names of the prisoners they want released, and the question that I found no one asking: how is it that we have 13-year-olds held by Israelis? How is it that we have young girls, young boys at school age that have been in Israeli prison now for 3-4 years? How is that? Why haven't we ever asked the question, what are these children doing languishing in Israeli jails? And by the way, these are 150 from amongst more than 4,700 prisoners, many others of whom are also minors, are women. And by the way, most of those have never been charged and don't stand trial. There are under what you call administrative detention, and therefore they're not charged with any particular crime. They're not standing before any particular court. They're just held there, and they could be held there for their entire lives. We have on record hundreds of Palestinians who have been in administrative detention for more than 18 years, and no one knows when their time will come when they will be released. So this is the situation that we are at. I personally think that the ceasefire agreed and the terms that are agreed are to the total frustration and anger and in a quarrel within Israel, especially the fact that the terms are that for 5 days they can't fly anything over the skies of Gaza, and that is extremely important, obviously from the strategic point of view, because if Hamas is going to release its hostages, it doesn't want Israeli drones monitoring where they're coming from, or how they're being moved or the such. So from the strategic point of view, it just shows, to be perfectly honest, the fact that that term was set as probably the second point. It shows an incredible nuance and understanding of the intelligence and security element on the side of Hamas.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for walking us through that. Really, really amazing insights. We'll move to questions in just a sec, but I want everybody who's watching to think about, after hearing Dr. Anas talk about, we're talking about the taking of hostages and then the conditions of administrative detention, which is really a euphemism. One would be entitled to ask what the difference is between the two, right? We have taking hostages on one hand, and we call something else administrative detention, and they resemble each other very, very closely. So that's an important thing. A lot of the last month and a half has drawn attention to the naming and how we name things, and how there's always a media slant when it comes to the way that certain things are named. Well, somebody can be picked up, and social media has shown us now children as young as 5, as young as 2, being abducted, kidnapped in this administrative, quote unquote, detention. Then what really is the difference? So with that said, we do have a couple nice questions here. Anstuya asks, what would be a good starting point to educate or inform fence sitters who think the current conflict will either tide over like they have in the past, or those that feel that it's all pointless?
Well, all of this, to be perfectly honest, you don't need to be a political scientist, and you don't need to be some sort of expert on Middle Eastern affairs in order to decide which side of the fence you need to be on. Millions of people around the world, I would even go as far as to suggest billions of people around the world, and regardless of their faith, regardless of their culture, regardless of their race, they have clearly identified the oppressor from the oppressed. And the mere fact that there are people that still fail to see with their own eyes, what I often advise my own family to watch the news, but to do it on mute, not to listen to the commentator, not to listen to the presenter, because the images are sufficient. The images are more than sufficient. And to be perfectly honest, I mean, when you have a conflict such as the one that we've seen, and this has been ongoing now for decades, but let's just take the last 6 weeks in consideration. Anyone who's watched any clip over the past 6 weeks and still feels that by sitting on the fence that they're in the best position, or they're doing the right thing, I think that they need their humanity checked. I think that they need their morality scrutinized. And I think that they need to ask themselves some very, very probing questions.
Brilliant response. We have several people who comment about lack of faith in the international institutions. One person in particular, Mahrez, asks why the UN won't act in this horrific situation. We were witnessing things happening in Ukraine not too long ago. Now even worse is happening and nothing's going on.
It's a very good question, and I think it brings to the fore the actual crisis that we find ourselves in as human beings, as a human population, and that is that what we call the international community or the international order doesn't seem to be working. And we know for a fact now, for many decades, that in the case of Palestine, it wasn't working. But even in preceding to this, events of horrific nature, such as what's happened in Syria, for instance, such as what's happened in Kashmir, for the Uyghurs, for the Uyghur, you start to wonder what use is the international community for, the United Nations, Security Council, and the such. Are these institutions fit for purpose anymore? I mean, the reports are fine and proper. I have to say that the initial statement of the UN General Secretary was something that we need to frame and hang on our walls. But okay, to what end? I mean, and that's why is it that we're governed by statements, by treaties, by declarations that read brilliantly, yet in reality have absolutely no meaning? When, for instance, the United Nations can be pressured by the United States not paying its shares, and therefore, basically being lobbied into towing a particular line. It's many questions emerge as a result of the failure of the international community and international institutions. And I fear for what that would mean, because what's the alternative? The alternative is, well, chaos, is that everyone runs the shop just like they desire or they see fit. And that is truly problematic. The issue of faith, by the way, and I'm going to frame it more accurately in terms of the issue of morality. The issue of morality, we have absolutely ripped out of our governing institutions, of our politics, of our economics, of our business, of our lives. And that is all to the detriment of everyone. And that's something that we as human beings, all of us, need to ask once again. Because you know what? In light of the incredible advancements that we're making on every single level, communications, finance, industry, everything, the fact of the matter is, we have around the world far more depression, far more suicides, far more conflicts, far more family dissolutions, far more breakups, far more social strife, far more wars, far more famine, far more disease. So all of these advancements, it seems, correlate somehow to more depression, more misery, more suffering on behalf of human beings. And the reason, I would suggest, one of the reasons at least, is the fact that all of this has been taken away from the aspect of morality, of ethics. You can't bring in the word moral to any kind of conversation, whether it be within a group who run a business venture, or amongst politicians, or amongst strategists, or the such. Once you start talking about morality, it's as though you're talking about, something that is unseen, something that people just simply can't get their minds around. It's something that we need to address once again. How do we restore morality in our dealings? How do we identify what is right, what is wrong? That I feel would restore a lot of agency to agencies that now have absolutely none.
Fantastic. Ruby K asks, what are the chances that all Palestinian prisoners will be released from Israeli prisons?
Not now, but I think that over the past 6 weeks we've seen something of a transformative nature in the struggle of the Palestinian people. What the Israelis have been dealt in terms of a humiliating defeat on the battlefield. I mean, bear in mind this: it took the United States and Britain, it took them something around 35 days to absolutely take over all of Iraq 20 years ago. It's been now 45, 46 days since one of the most advanced armies in the world, backed by the United States, backed by Britain, backed by France, have been shelling this tiny strip of land, which you can't actually see on the world atlas with the naked eye. For 46 days, they've been shelling incessantly, yet they haven't managed to achieve a single, and I mean a single, strategic objective on the field. So from the military point of view, they've been dealt a humiliating defeat. From the media point of view, despite the fact that media outlets, including our own BBC, which only a few years ago used to be, the sort of emblem, epitome of media professionalism, impartiality, and the such, objectivity, has rid itself of all of that, has never claimed that it is anything but towing the Israeli narrative. Even so, the media war has been absolutely won by a landslide by the Palestinian side. We've seen the emergence of brave, young, even Jewish voices from around the world that are not only criticizing Israel for the genocide it's committing, but calling Israel by names which I personally never ever thought a Jewish American, a young man and woman would ever call Israel apartheid, committing genocide, committing war crimes, demanding that Netanyahu and Israeli leaders be hauled before the Hague, and all this 6 weeks, as painful as it has been for the people of Gaza, and it's been painful just watching. Imagine living there. Imagine those parents holding the bodies of their children, their dead children. It's something that the heart really, breaks time and time again to the scene of. But the fact is that we have just seen a transformative moment. What was before the 7th of October is definitely not what is coming after the 7th of October. I think there are many dynamics. Israel, besides the billions and billions it's lost financially, I think in terms of political credit within its own communities, by the way, within the Jewish communities around the world, I think it's made losses that I'm not entirely sure that it actually can restore however much it piles in terms of monies or PR campaigns or the such.
One final question, and we'll let you proceed with your early morning. Lunar Sky asks, very similar question. Does a Palestinian state have a better chance now? What happens after this war to Gaza, to Palestine?
Okay, if it's okay with you, Imam Tom, I'm going to depart a little from my political seat here and say something that might be a little bit surprising. I don't care for a Palestinian state. I don't care for an Iraqi state. I don't care for a Syrian state. I don't care for an Egyptian state. The states we have are a failure. They are failed entities. They are elements that subjugate, that brutalize, that suppress their own people. We've seen how, we're talking about the hundreds of thousands of people marching across the capitals of the world, the cities of the world, but yet they're quite wanting where it matters most, in the Arab and Muslim nations, the Arab countries surrounding Gaza, only a stone's throw away from Gaza, where I'm not really worried about a Palestinian state. I think that the return of human dignity, of human freedom, real freedom, is what we should yearn for. I'm looking for what happened 100 years ago at the hands of the Brits particularly, and also the French and other colonial powers, by shredding apart a nation that was joined by a language, that was joined by a faith, that was joined by a culture, that was joined by a way of life, including, by the way, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. We've always had Christian and Jewish communities living within us. My father tells me about their Jewish neighbors, about how when they were little and their parents needed to go out, they would go and stay at their Jewish neighbors, how their children would come and they would play with each other. In every single Arab capital, there is always a Jewish quarter. In Cairo, in Damascus, in Beirut, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Morocco. That was never an issue. That was never an issue. The project that was imposed upon this region was a Zionist project in order to subjugate the entire region, to steal its riches. It was a colonial project. It was similar to the Crusades, by the way. The Crusades of many centuries ago, of 10 centuries ago, started as the first modern manifestations of an imperialistic colonial venture covered by the guise of religion. You want to go to heaven? This is the way. You go and you die in the Holy Land for the crucifix, for our Lord, and that's how you guarantee your place in heaven. Otherwise, it was pure imperialistic colonial manifestations that then developed into what we see today. So my concern is not for a state. That might be a step. Okay, if it's in the right direction, then it's in the right direction. If it's under correct conditions, then that's fine. But if ultimately we're going to create an entity that will be at the behest of the IMF and then be ruled undemocratically by another Arab and Muslim regime, just like the ones that we have scattered across the region, then I'm sorry, then that's not what we're looking for. We are looking for true human liberation. And by the way, the Palestinians are teaching us that lesson. They are fully aware of this. Out of all of those, the hundreds whom we've heard after, their houses have been demolished, their children have been killed and slaughtered, not one of them said, my hope is that I will one day stand in a free Palestinian state. A free Palestinian state is not their objective. Their objective is true freedom and liberation. Now, this needs probably another conversation as to what we're talking about, but please, let's not reduce all this struggle, all this sacrifice, all this pain and suffering, so that ultimately we can come up with something that has a national flag, a national emblem, a football team, and then call ourselves free. That's not the real meaning of freedom.
MashaAllah. That's very profound and very timely. And I'm just going to repackage exactly what you said very briefly so that everybody in the audience is a crucial point that I don't want them to lose or to misunderstand, is that what we're after is so much larger than a state that we can't simply focus on this one thing, which is a technology. A state is a political technology that is meant to achieve certain ends, such as liberation, such as justice, such as equity, such as, all the meaning in our lives, right? If we only focus on the technology, it might very well come to pass that we might get that political technology, we might get our state, but it might have none of the things that we're hoping that we really want.
Absolutely.
So we have to, from now, we cannot simply box our dreams into or latch our dreams onto just that mere political technology. We have to imagine the future in such a way that we're actually pursuing the things that maybe some of us assume a state will provide, such as dignity, such as lasting peace, equity, all the things that we mentioned. And so everybody has to, this is really a crucial point that everybody has to, maybe, I hope that you rewatch this. If you're watching this now, click rewind, the last 10 minutes, go over it again to really understand what we're saying here, is that we can't get hung up on just on a short-term goal or something that might not serve what we're really after. And we need to start imagining the future from now. Because if we do not imagine the future and how to get there from now, then what is at stake and what could happen is the same thing that has happened to Egypt, the same thing that has happened to Jordan, the same thing that has happened to the other nations, where we get our state, but it doesn't serve the people. It doesn't serve justice. It doesn't serve dignity. It doesn't serve all the things that we're really after. Dr. Anas, this has been a tremendous conversation. I've benefited a lot. And inshallah, I hope inshallah in the spring to be around the UK, inshallah, and I would love to pay you a
Be a
visit if
pleasure
you'll
to
permit
host
me.
you.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll stay in touch, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair, Imam Tom. This has been fantastic, and greetings to you and to all the brothers and sisters listening from or watching from around the world. Jazakumullahu khair.
Ameen wa yakum. And for everybody that's tuning in, we're just going to give 5 minutes, because that was a very, very thorough exposition. 5 minutes if anybody has any questions for me or comments. I know a lot of people, I tried to repackage and retranslate what Dr. Anas was saying, because I was fearing that maybe some people would misunderstand it. He's not saying that we should not pursue a Palestinian state, but what we're saying is that we need to dream bigger than that and not fall into the same mistakes that people before, because this is, if you want to go into history, this is the post-colonial situation that a lot of the Muslim nations have fallen into, where we thought coming out of World War II, we thought coming out of European colonization, that this was going to be the end of our problems. We get the state, we get liberation. That doesn't always work that way. That you can have a state and not have liberation. You can have a state and not have dignity. And if the powers that are dominating and subjugating us right now, if they are preventing us from dignity and preventing us from a state, if they can get away with just giving us a state in Palestine and still not give us dignity, make that state a slave to the IMF, a slave to the international order, a slave to foreign interests, then they will do so, if it means preventing us from true liberation and true dignity, and something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be pleased with. So we'll just, again, give just a few more minutes for anyone for questions. Very, very pleased. Thank you, everybody, who interacted. A lot of people are saying in the chat it was a very enlightening conversation. I agree completely. And may Allah bless this gathering and make it a gathering that is pleasing to Him and accepted by Him. I don't see any other questions, so we've already gone over time. We'll wrap up for tonight. We have many exciting guests coming in the following weeks. We have people who have faced backlash when it comes to being smeared, either from Zionist media or Islamophobic media. We have people who are on the street participating in activism. We have people who are internationally very, very well known, who are going to help us sharpen our political analysis, like we've been doing here today in the past several weeks. So please, everybody, continue to think, to educate yourself, to spread the word, and to tune in next week, inshallah ta'ala. Barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.